On a forgotten stretch of Texas highway, there once stood a motel that promised nothing more than rest for the weary. Clean rooms, hot coffee, a neon sign glowing through the dark. But over 3 decades, that motel became something else entirely. Guests checked in and never checked out. Whole families, young couples, travelers whose names were never spoken again. By 2001, the property was condemned. The walls were torn down, the grounds bulldozed flat. But something survived the fire, the mold, and the silence. A single ledger. Inside its brittle pages, names appeared. Names of the missing, and sometimes names that had not yet disappeared. This is the story of the motel ledger and the disappearances it refused to forget. If you're drawn to true crime mysteries, to unsolved vanishings and the shadows they leave behind, subscribe now. Summer 1982. The sun was low when David and Laura Hensley pulled into the Red Haven Motel, a squat, single-story row of rooms set along Highway 183. They had been married less than a year, their old Chevy Impala stuffed with camping gear, maps folded with pencil marks, the youthful ambition of a couple determined to see America one cheap motel at a time. They didn't know Red Haven had its own history, whispered rumors of travelers who'd stayed once and never checked out. But at that hour, with the desert wind pressing against the car and Laura's hand resting lightly on David's arm, all they saw was vacancy. The night clerk was thin, with the pale look of someone who had never been far from the dim lobby lamp. He slid the ledger across the counter with deliberate care. Laura signed her name first, looping her L as if trying to make her presence permanent. David followed with hurried strokes. The clerk nodded, assigned them room 9, and returned to his seat without another word. Later, a trucker reported hearing faint shouts coming from the direction of room 9. He didn't stop. Truckers kept moving. A local farmer recalled seeing lights flicker around midnight, brighter than they should have been, but he dismissed it as his imagination. The next morning, the Impala was gone. Room 9 was stripped bare. No luggage, no clothing, no trace of the Hensleys. The ledger remained, though their names on the page looked strangely smudged, as if water had soaked into the ink. The sheriff's office filed a missing persons report. Flyers went up in nearby towns, but weeks turned into months, and the case grew cold. The motel owner closed Red Haven by the end of that summer, citing personal reasons. And the ledger, the book where David and Laura had left their last signatures, stayed behind, gathering dust. Decades later, it would be found again. The Red Haven Motel had been abandoned for so long that locals stopped pointing it out. Travelers passed it without slowing, the way one instinctively avoids eye contact with a stranger muttering on the street. Its roof sagged, its windows were either boarded or smashed, and weeds curled around the foundations like skeletal fingers reclaiming what once belonged to the desert. But for Thomas Greer, retired detective and recent widower, the Red Haven Motel was not invisible. It was unavoidable. He stood in the gravel lot one late afternoon in April, his hands sunk into the pockets of his windbreaker. The wind kicked grit across his shoes. Behind him, his niece's sedan idled with the trunk half open, cardboard boxes visible inside. She had insisted on driving him here, insisted he shouldn't be alone, but Thomas had waved her back into the car. This was something he needed to see for himself. The motel belonged to him now. It had come in the form of a letter. A legal notice from a law office in Abilene stating that an estranged cousin, someone Thomas hadn't seen in decades, had passed, leaving the property to him. No one else had wanted it. No one else had claimed it. The attorney called it a burden more than an asset. But the moment Thomas read the words Red Haven Motel, he felt a pulse in his chest. He remembered. He had been a rookie deputy in 1982 when the Hensleys vanished. His superior had been the one to handle the case, but Thomas had tagged along during canvassing. He remembered knocking on doors, hearing the locals' muttered gossip. feeling the strangeness of the motel lobby even then. He remembered the smell of mildew and dust, the night clerk's hollow eyes. And he remembered how quickly the investigation collapsed. No bodies, no car, no evidence. Now, almost 40 years later, the building was his. He exhaled, the dry air scraping his throat, and stepped toward the lobby. The door groaned against his hand before giving way, revealing the stale darkness inside. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary kind, but the thick, suffocating quiet of a place abandoned mid-breath. A chair still sat behind the check-in desk. A lamp leaned against the wall, its shade collapsed inward like a broken lung. A telephone with a coiled cord hung limply off its cradle. Thomas stepped farther in. His shoes crunched against grit and broken glass. The air smelled faintly of paper, mold, and rodent droppings. And then he saw it. On the counter, half buried beneath a layer of dust, lay a book. He froze. The ledger. Its leather cover was cracked like sunburned skin, the corners softened from decades of touch. Dust clung to its surface, but the gold-embossed word, GUESTS, was still faintly visible. His fingers hesitated before he reached for it. Something in him resisted, the way one resists touching a gravestone too soon after burial. But curiosity, that old demon, pressed harder. He brushed the dust away and opened it. The pages crackled faintly. Inside, names marched in tidy lines, one after another. Couples, families, lone travelers, each with a date, a room number, and a check-in time. Thomas's throat tightened. He recognized some of them. Not personally, but from old missing persons reports. There was Laura and David Hensley, July 1982, room 9. The page following their entry was ripped jaggedly down the middle, as if someone had torn it out in haste. He flipped forward. August 1984. Another couple. Names circled faintly in pencil. He turned more pages. The pattern repeated. Clusters of names matching long cold cases from Central Texas, all of them tied to the motel, all of them vanishing without explanation. The deeper he read, the colder he felt. His own handwriting had appeared once, scrawled at the margin in his rookie days. Interview locals. No leads. He barely remembered writing it. Time slowed. Thomas closed the book abruptly and leaned against the counter, his heart thudding like it wanted out. The motel hadn't just been a waypoint for travelers. It had been something else entirely. A trap. A funnel where people entered and then disappeared, swallowed by silence and dust. "Uncle Tom?" His niece called from outside, her voice muffled by the walls. He closed his eyes, steadying himself before answering. "I'm fine," he lied. But he wasn't. Not at all. The next morning he returned with coffee in a thermos and gloves on his hands. He sat at the desk where countless clerks had once signed in guests and opened the ledger again, forcing himself to move slower this time. Page after page. Entry after entry. The book felt endless, like it was feeding him names rather than surrendering them. Some names had checkout times noted neatly, but others didn't. Others ended abruptly mid-stroke, the ink bleeding into nothingness. He noticed something else, a symbol. Small, barely visible, a faint cross-like mark in the corner of certain entries. Not every missing person had it, but many did. A code. The thought chilled him. Whoever had kept this ledger wasn't just recording names, they were marking them, selecting them. He leaned back, his jaw tight. The ledger wasn't just a record. It was evidence. Evidence no one had ever bothered to see. He thought of calling the sheriff's office immediately, but then he remembered the cases he had worked, the dismissals, the bureaucracy. He imagined an officer flipping through the pages, shrugging, filing it away under property cleanup. Number. Not yet. Thomas wanted to understand first. He needed to see where the trail led. So he began with the earliest entries, copying the names onto a notepad. He cross-referenced the dates with what he remembered, what he could dig up from old newspaper archives. The Hensleys were only the beginning. There were more, dozens more. The motel had eaten people, and now, after all these years, the ledger had spat their names back out. Thomas closed the book, staring at the cracked ceiling. For the first time in months, since before his wife's death, he felt something like purpose stirring in his veins. This ledger was speaking. He intended to listen. The library in Abilene hadn't changed much since Thomas last visited it 20 years ago. The carpet was still the color of faded moss, the fluorescent lights still hummed faintly overhead, and the old wooden tables bore carved initials of restless students who had passed through long before the internet took hold. Thomas sat with the ledger propped open beside his notepad, the librarian casting him occasional curious glances. He hadn't told her what he was researching, only that he needed access to microfilm records of the Abilene Reporter news archives. She obliged, but her gaze lingered on the ledger as though it carried a weight heavier than its pages. The machine whirred softly as he scrolled through the rolls of film, headlines rushing by in a blur of years. 1981. Local fair opens. 1982. County budget dispute. 1983. Teacher retires after 40 years. He stopped when he reached July 1982. There it was. Austin couple vanishes during summer road trip. The article was brief. David and Laura Hensley had last been seen checking into a motel near Cisco, Texas. Their car was missing. Their families were pleading for information. No foul play was suspected at the time. Thomas tapped his pen against the desk. He remembered the casual way the sheriff had closed the case file within weeks. Probably ran off together, he'd muttered. Couples do that all the time. But they hadn't. Their names were in the ledger, stamped with that faint cross mark in the corner. Someone had taken them. He flipped forward. August 1984. Young pair from Lubbock disappears en route to Dallas. The details mirrored the Hensleys. Checked into a motel, never checked out. Authorities at the time speculated that they'd hitched a ride or simply left town. Their families had never believed it. Thomas rubbed the bridge of his nose. 2 couples, same pattern, same location, and those weren't the only names marked in the ledger. He had copied 12 so far, all spanning between 1982 and 1995. 12 unsolved vanishings linked to the Red Haven Motel. The pattern gnawed at him. He could almost feel the ledger whispering at his elbow. Look closer. There's more. By evening, he was back in his small bungalow. The ledger spread out across his kitchen table. A yellow notepad beside it bloomed with notes, arrows, and dates. Coffee cups gathered like sentries, cooling beside his elbow. His wife, Marion, had once teased him about this kind of work. "You're happiest when you're tangled up in other people's mysteries," she used to say. "You forget to eat, forget to sleep, but you look alive in a way you never do otherwise." Her absence still ached, but tonight the ache blended with the thrum of purpose. Thomas turned another page. The handwriting shifted slightly, a different clerk, maybe, or the same hand aged over years. Some entries were neat and elegant, others jagged and rushed. But the crossmark symbol remained, scratched faintly in corners like a signature of doom. He thought about the clerk. Who had made these marks? The ledger had been kept behind the counter. Only employees would have handled it. Was it the thin night clerk he remembered from 1982? The one who avoided eye contact? Or was there someone else behind the desk at different times, quietly tagging certain names as if marking prey? He shivered. The clock struck midnight, its sound unusually loud in the quiet house. Thomas realized his stomach was hollow. He hadn't eaten since noon. With a sigh, he closed the ledger and placed it gently on the counter. "Tomorrow," he murmured, as if promising the book itself. "Tomorrow, I'll dig deeper." The next morning, he drove out to the county courthouse. He hadn't been back since retirement. The clerk at the records desk looked surprised when he introduced himself, but she smiled kindly, perhaps remembering his years of service. "I'm looking for property records," Thomas explained. "Specifically the Red Haven Motel. Ownership records, employees, that sort of thing." She nodded and disappeared into the back, returning with 2 thick folders bound in twine. "Not much demand for these," she said. "Last time anyone asked was the mid-90s. Thomas carried them to a quiet corner table. The folders smelled of dust and old ink, their contents a jumble of deeds, tax receipts, and typed employment rosters. He sifted carefully. The motel had been built in 1967 by a man named Robert Halverson. It passed through 3 different owners by the early 80s, eventually landing in the hands of a couple named Darrell and Elaine Mason. The Masons owned it during the time of the Hensley disappearance. Employee records were thin, mostly part-time clerks and housekeepers, but one name repeated, appearing on payroll documents year after year: Eldon Carr. Thomas frowned, the name tugging at his memory. He flipped back to 1982. Yes, that was it. Eldon Carr had been the thin night clerk. He leaned back, staring at the name. The man had worked at the motel for over 15 years, through multiple owners. Always on the payroll, always present. And now, Thomas jotted the name into his notebook, circling it heavily. That evening, he called a friend from his old precinct, a sergeant still active in the sheriff's office. "Eldon Carr," Thomas said when his friend answered. "Do you know if he's still around?" There was a pause, then, "Carr? Yeah, I think so. Lives out near Breckenridge, if I'm not mistaken. Old trailer on the edge of town." "Why?" Thomas hesitated. "I might need to pay him a visit." "Just following a trail." "You're retired, Tom," the sergeant said gently. "You don't need to chase ghosts anymore." But Thomas only thanked him and hung up. He stared at the ledger lying on his table. Ghosts or not, the trail was alive. The drive to Breckenridge was long and lonely, the kind of road where time seemed to stretch. Dust clouds swirled across the asphalt. Barbed wire fences bordered fields of dry grass. The sun hung low, orange bleeding into violet. Thomas found the trailer easily. It sagged under its own weight, the aluminum siding dented, windows covered in sheets instead of curtains. A dog barked weakly somewhere inside. He parked across the road and sat for a moment, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He hadn't planned what to say. He wasn't even sure Carr would remember him, let alone talk. Finally, he stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot, and crossed toward the trailer. The door opened before he could knock. An old man stood there, thin as a rail, his eyes sunken and suspicious. His hair was sparse, his shirt stained with grease. "Yes?" the man rasped. "Eldon Carr?" Thomas asked. The man squinted. "Who's asking?" "Thomas Greer. Sheriff's Department. Retired now. We met a long time ago. Red Haven Motel." At the mention of the motel, something flickered in Eldon's expression, a quick shadow across his face. His grip on the doorframe tightened. "That place is gone," Eldon said flatly. "Ain't nothing left there." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know. But I found something. The ledger. Your handwriting's in it." Eldon's jaw twitched. His eyes darted to the road, then back to Thomas. For a moment, the old man looked as if he might slam the door shut. Instead, he sighed, shoulders sagging. "You better come in," he muttered. The inside of the trailer smelled of tobacco and mildew. Stacks of old newspapers were piled against the walls. A single bulb lit the space with sickly yellow light. The dog, a mutt with gray fur, lay curled on a tattered blanket, watching silently. Eldon gestured to a chair, then lowered himself into another with a wheeze. "Ledger, you say?" he asked, his voice cautious. Thomas nodded. "It's full of names. Some of them belong to people who vanished. Their entries are marked. You worked there long enough. You know something. Eldon rubbed his temples with trembling fingers. That book should have burned with the rest. The rest? The old man didn't answer immediately. He stared at the floor, his breathing shallow. Then he whispered, "Some things don't want to be remembered." Thomas leaned forward. "What happened to them, Eldon? To the Hensleys? To the others?" Silence. Only the faint hum of the bulb and the dog's slow breathing. Finally, Eldon looked up, his eyes glassy. "You really want to know?" Thomas held his gaze. "Yes." Eldon's lips trembled into a bitter smile. "Then God help you." For a long time, Eldon didn't speak. He leaned back in the chair, his hands trembling faintly on the armrests. His eyes had that faraway glaze Thomas knew well, the look of someone balancing on the edge of memory, deciding whether to step forward or turn away. Thomas waited. Patience was a skill honed in interrogation rooms, and he could still wield it like a blade. At last, Eldon exhaled. "I was just the clerk," he said, his voice low. "You need to understand that. I didn't have a say in who came or went. I just kept the books, the ledger," Thomas prompted. Eldon nodded. "That ledger's older than me, older than Redhaven. They brought it when they opened the place, said it came with the property. Rules were rules, everyone signed in, and those marks—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "Those weren't mine." Thomas leaned forward. "But you saw them." "I saw plenty," Eldon muttered. He rubbed at his eyes with bony fingers. "Sometimes folks checked in, bright-eyed and smiling. Then they just disappeared. Next morning their room was empty, bed made, like they'd never been there. Only thing left was their name in that book, with a mark beside it. Always the same symbol, always the same end." Thomas's throat was dry. "Who made the marks?" Eldon looked away. His silence was louder than denial. "Eldon," Thomas pressed, "you worked there for 15 years. If you didn't make the marks, who did?" The old man's voice cracked. "Darrell Mason." Thomas froze, the name from the property records. The owner during the 1980s. "He was polite enough in public," Eldon continued, his voice thin. "Family man. Wife, little boy. But he was the one who kept the ledger, said it was tradition. Every time he marked a name, I knew it meant trouble. Those guests never lasted the night." The room seemed to shrink around them. Thomas could hear his own pulse in his ears. "What happened to them?" he asked quietly. Eldon's eyes darted toward the darkened corner of the trailer as if someone might be listening. "Don't ask me that," he whispered. "I never wanted to know. I just knew not to open certain doors. Rooms that should have been empty weren't. Sometimes I heard sounds through the vents at night. Screams. Other times, laughter. Not the kind you want to hear." Thomas's skin prickled. He scribbled the words, "rooms." "Screams." "Mason?" Into his notebook, though his hand shook. "Why didn't you go to the sheriff?" he asked. Eldon let out a hollow laugh. "You think the sheriff didn't know? Half the deputies got free rooms there when they needed to sleep off a shift. Mason was well liked. Nobody wanted to cross him, and me? I was just a clerk. Poor sick mother at home. What was I going to do? Risk ending up like the rest?" His words rang with desperation, but also truth. Thomas had seen enough corruption in small towns to know it was possible. Eldon's gaze fixed on Thomas suddenly, sharp despite his age. "You opened that ledger, didn't you? You stirred it up again. You should have left it where it was." Thomas felt a chill creep into his bones. "What do you mean?" Eldon's voice dropped to a rasp. "That book doesn't like to be remembered. It holds on to the ones it takes, and if you keep chasing it, you'll end up in it too." The words clung to Thomas long after he left the trailer. The drive home blurred by in streaks of headlights and shadow, his mind circling the conversation like a vulture. The ledger wasn't just evidence. To Eldon, it was something alive. something cursed. But Thomas couldn't afford superstition. He had spent his life on logic, on facts. Even if the book felt heavy in his hands, even if it seemed to whisper when he turned the pages, it was still just paper and ink. Wasn't it? At home, he placed the ledger on the table once more. The cracked leather looked almost expectant, like a predator waiting. He forced himself to open to the page with the Hensleys' names. His eyes traced the ink, the faint smudge in the margin. What had really happened in room 9? He closed his eyes, trying to reconstruct it. The couple arriving, weary from travel. Eldon handing them the key. Darrell Mason watching from the office. Later, a mark scratched beside their names. And then, nothing. Vanished, erased. Thomas rubbed his temples. He had been at this long enough to know patterns. Disappearances didn't happen without cause. Someone had taken those people. Someone had hidden the evidence. And the ledger wasn't just a record. It was a list of victims. But if Mason had been behind it, where was the proof? Where were the bodies? He flipped through the pages until his fingers stopped on a date. September 1989. A young woman named Claire Rowley. Room 12. No checkout recorded. Something about the name stirred him. He dug through his notepad until he found it. A missing persons bulletin he'd copied from the archives. Claire Rowley, 19, last seen traveling alone from Oklahoma City to Austin. Family insisted she'd never have run away. Thomas stared at the ledger, then at the bulletin. The match was undeniable. A thought struck him, sharp and unrelenting. Maybe not everything had been erased. Maybe something still lingered at the motel. 2 days later, he drove back to Red Haven. The motel stood against the flat horizon, unchanged. The neon sign sagged, the broken letters spelling nothing. Weeds pressed against the steps. He carried a flashlight, gloves, and a crowbar. The sun was sinking, shadows stretching long. He hesitated at the threshold, the memory of Eldon's words echoing. If you keep chasing it, you'll end up in it too. But he pushed forward. Inside, the lobby was as empty as before. He moved past it, down the hallway of rooms. Doors stood ajar, revealing stripped mattresses, peeling wallpaper, rodent droppings scattered across the floor. Each step stirred dust into the air. He stopped at room 12. The door hung crooked on its hinges. He pushed it open, the smell of mildew rolling out. The room was dim, the curtain moth-eaten, the carpet stiff with age. His flashlight beam swept across the walls, nothing but cracked plaster and stains. Then, across the floor. There, by the bed frame, the light caught something. A scrap of fabric, blue, faded, but intact. Thomas crouched, heart hammering. He lifted it gently. A corner of denim. Women's jeans, by the look of it, too small to belong to a man. Claire Rowley. His pulse quickened. He scanned the rest of the room, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Near the vent, another glint. Metal. He pried it free. A small silver bracelet, tarnished but engraved faintly. CR proof. The ledger wasn't just names and marks. It was a map. And room 12 had just yielded its secret. Thomas sank onto the bed frame, the bracelet cold in his palm. He knew what this meant. The motel was still holding its dead. And if he kept searching, he might uncover more than he was prepared to face. The silence pressed heavy, thick as soil. He pocketed the bracelet, but as he stood, he felt it again, the sensation of being watched. The corridor behind him seemed darker than when he'd entered, and for the first time since opening the ledger, Thomas wondered if Eldon had been right. Maybe some doors should stay closed. Thomas barely slept that night. He set the bracelet on his desk, next to the ledger, and sat staring at them both for hours. The silver charm seemed to glow faintly under the lamplight, though he knew it was only the tarnish catching the bulb's warmth. Still, the effect was unsettling, a whisper of the girl who had worn it, a ghost rising from the ledger's pages. When dawn broke, he finally stood, shoulders heavy. The case was no longer abstract. He could see her. Claire Rowley, 19, denim jeans, silver bracelet, last seen alive walking into Red Haven Motel. Now, a scrap of fabric and a keepsake were all that remained. He had enough to stir the authorities, but not enough to prove anything. A bracelet and a scrap of cloth could be dismissed, shrugged off as coincidence. He needed something stronger. By mid-morning, Thomas was parked outside the county courthouse, coffee cooling in his hand. The building was an old brick relic, its facade cracked but dignified. He walked the steps slowly, aware of how his name still carried weight here. Retired detective. Some whispered it with respect, others with suspicion, but it opened doors. Inside, he requested the Red Haven property files. The clerk, a young man with a wary look, disappeared into the back. "You sure you want those?" the clerk asked when he returned, balancing a heavy stack of folders. "That motel's got a reputation." Thomas didn't answer. He carried the files to a reading table, the ledger tucked under his arm. The documents smelled of mildew and ink. He sifted through deeds, tax forms, inspection reports. Darrell Mason's name appeared over and over, always neat in typewritten blocks. But then, buried in a 1991 foreclosure notice, another name surfaced. Property transferred to William Carnes, caretaker and executor of the Mason estate. Thomas froze. The surname prickled like a burr in his memory. He flipped open his old notepad, the one with clipped reports and scribbled notes from decades past. There it was, Carnes. A deputy's report from 1989 mentioning a Charlie Carnes, suspected in a missing hitchhiker case near Marble Falls. Charges never filed. So the motel had passed from Mason to Carnes, and people kept disappearing. Thomas leaned back, pressing his palms against his eyes. This wasn't a single man's cruelty. This was a chain, a legacy, like the ledger itself. That afternoon, he drove to the edge of town where the Carnes property was listed. A farmhouse, weathered but still standing, sat back from the road, half hidden by trees. No one answered the door when he knocked. He circled slowly, noting the sagging barn, the rusted truck abandoned in the weeds, the silence that felt almost rehearsed. On the porch sat a rocking chair, its seat worn thin. Someone had lived here, recently. He crouched, running his fingers over the dirt. Tire tracks cut fresh into the mud. Someone still came and went. Evening crept in as he returned home. He poured a drink, though he barely touched it. His hands went to the ledger again. He turned the brittle pages until he reached the late 1980s. There it was, Claire Rowley. And beneath her, another name, Stephen and Marla Holt. Room 3. No checkout. A faint mark. Thomas frowned. The Holts were not in the missing persons files he'd pulled. Why not? Couples didn't just vanish unnoticed, unless no one was looking. He marked the page with a slip of paper and sat back. The motel was hiding entire families, erasing them with the stroke of a pen. And the ledger wasn't merely record. It was ritual. A soft knock startled him. He glanced at the clock. Nearly 9. When he opened the door, a woman stood on the porch. Gray hair, eyes sharp despite her age. "You're Thomas Hale," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted around each other nervously. "Yes, and you are?" "My name's Linda Holt." Thomas's pulse quickened. She continued, her eyes darting past him toward the ledger visible on the table. "I heard you're asking about the motel, about the names. Stephen and Marla Holt were my parents." Thomas let her in. She sat at the table, staring at the ledger like it might leap toward her. He pushed the marked page toward her gently. She nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "That's them." 1987. "We were driving cross-country. I was 12. I remember the neon sign, the smell of damp carpet. We stayed the night in room 3. Next morning, I woke up alone. The manager told me my parents had left early, said they'd checked out and let me sleep. Her voice cracked. But they never came back. I was placed in foster care the same week Thomas's throat tightened. And no one investigated? Not properly, she said bitterly. The motel told the sheriff they'd seen my parents drive off. Said maybe they left me behind by accident. Everyone treated it like abandonment. She touched the faded ink in the ledger, her finger trembling. But I know they never left. I heard voices that night. I heard my parents arguing with someone in the hall. Then, silence. Thomas swallowed hard. Why come forward now? Her eyes met his, fierce despite the tears. Because I heard you found something. Because the dead deserve better than silence. She leaned closer. And because I saw a man yesterday, at the market. He looked just like the manager from that night. Older, heavier, but I'd know him anywhere. Thomas's heart pounded. Daryl Mason? She shook her head slowly. No, the other one. Carnes. The name hit like a stone. The chain was still unbroken. And now, Thomas realized, so was the danger. Thomas poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, though neither of them drank. The steam rose, curling between him and Linda Holt, carrying the bitter scent of burnt beans and old anxieties. Linda's hands rested flat on the table, close to the ledger but not touching it, as though the book radiated a heat she couldn't bear. Her voice was steady now, but her eyes glimmered with the memory of a wound that had never healed. You said you saw Carnes at the market, Thomas prompted gently. Linda nodded. Yesterday morning. He was standing by the apples, of all places, laughing with the cashier, like he belonged there. He had a scar now, across his chin. But it was him. I remember that face from when I was 12. He leaned over me when the police came, told them my parents had just forgotten me. She shuddered. No one forgets their child like that. Thomas scribbled in his notebook. He wanted facts, details, something solid, but there was weight in her conviction, a survivor's certainty. Did you follow him? Thomas asked. Linda hesitated. I did. Stupid, I know. He drove a blue pickup, older model. I stayed behind far enough not to be seen. He turned onto County Road 16, near the old rail yard. Thomas stiffened. The Carnes farmhouse wasn't far from there. Linda lowered her voice. I didn't tell anyone else. People don't like when you stir up the past around here. They tell you to let sleeping dogs lie. But I've been living with this silence for 30 years. It's not a dog, Mr. Hale. It's a graveyard. Thomas closed his notebook softly. You came to the right person. The next morning, Thomas and Linda drove together out toward County Road 16. The sun cut pale across the fields, burning mist off the grass. Linda sat tense in the passenger seat, clutching a scarf around her neck like a shield. The Carnes farmhouse emerged from the tree line, the same sagging porch, the same rusting barn. But this time, a blue pickup was parked in the drive. There, Linda whispered. Thomas slowed the car, pulling off onto the shoulder where weeds brushed the fenders. His pulse quickened. He hadn't hunted in years, but the old instinct stirred awake. Observe, wait, record. A man stepped onto the porch, broad-shouldered, hair silvered but thick, a scar slashing across his chin. He carried a box, heavy enough to strain his arms. He set it in the bed of the pickup with a grunt. Linda's breath caught. That's him. Thomas studied the man through binoculars. The years had carved their lines into him, but the confidence was intact, the gait of someone who believed himself untouchable. They watched in silence as Carnes loaded 2 more boxes. Then he lit a cigarette, leaning against the truck, eyes sweeping the horizon. For a moment Thomas felt exposed, as though those eyes might pierce the brush and find him. But Carnes turned away, flicking ash into the dirt. Finally, the man climbed into the truck and drove off, dust curling behind the wheels. Thomas exhaled slowly. "You see where he goes?" Linda murmured. "We'll know what he's hiding." They followed at a cautious distance. Carnes drove with purpose, winding down narrow roads that cut through brush and stone. Finally, he turned onto a rutted track leading into the woods. Thomas parked 100 yards back. They walked the rest of the way, branches clawing at their clothes. Through the trees they saw it, a clearing littered with debris. Old barrels, scrap metal, a collapsed shed. Carnes's truck sat parked beside a concrete structure half sunken into the ground, like the mouth of a bunker. Moss clung to the walls. Carnes unlocked a rusted door and carried one of the boxes inside. When he emerged minutes later, his hands were empty. "What's in there?" Linda whispered. Thomas's chest tightened. "Something worth hiding." They crouched until Carnes had finished unloading and driven away. Only then did Thomas step from the brush, his boots crunching softly on gravel. He approached the concrete door, testing the handle. Locked. He knelt, running his hand over the rust, the faint marks on the frame. Scratches, shallow but deliberate, like someone had clawed at it. Behind him, Linda's voice trembled. "This is where they are, isn't it?" Thomas didn't answer, but the silence was answer enough. That night, back at his home, Thomas spread maps across his table. Red Haven, County Road 16, the clearing. The ledger lay open beside them, its brittle pages heavy with accusation. Linda sat across from him, her eyes on the bracelet resting in a dish. "You think my parents are in there?" she said softly. "I think," Thomas replied, "that bunker has secrets the sheriff won't want to touch. But if we open it—" He hesitated. "We'll need proof, not just suspicion. Otherwise, Carnes walks again." Linda leaned forward, fierce now. "Then we get proof." Her determination jolted Thomas. For years, he'd pursued cases alone, chasing shadows. But here was someone whose life had been carved open by the motel's silence, someone willing to face it head on. For the first time since he'd opened the ledger, Thomas realized he wasn't alone. The following evening, Thomas returned to the clearing, this time with tools: crowbar, flashlight, gloves. Linda had insisted on coming, but he persuaded her to stay near the road. If anything went wrong, she'd be their lifeline. The woods whispered around him as he forced the crowbar into the lock. Rust flaked, metal groaned. Finally, the shackle gave with a snap. He pushed the door open. The air that rushed out was damp, sour, the stench of rot and earthbound things. He raised the flashlight, its beam cutting through dust. Steps led downward, concrete walls sweating with moisture. He descended slowly, the silence amplifying every heartbeat. At the bottom, the room opened wide. Concrete floor, low ceiling, and boxes. Dozens of them, stacked against the walls, some rotted through, spilling yellowed paper. But it wasn't the papers that stopped him. It was the smell. Thomas moved the beam. In the far corner, against the damp wall, lay bones. Dozens, long femurs, ribs collapsed inward, skulls staring eyeless into the dark. Some wrapped in tatters of clothing, some bare, all jumbled together. His throat constricted. The ledger hadn't lied. Every mark, every missing checkout, they were here. Thomas stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering against the floor. He caught himself on the wall, gasping. His mind screamed to turn and run, but his body froze, transfixed by the truth at last unearthed. Behind him, he thought he heard something. A creak on the steps above. The door. Closing. The slam of the bunker door echoed like a gunshot. Thomas jerked his head upward, flashlight beam trembling across the concrete ceiling. The shaft of daylight had vanished. Only a thin line of shadow showed where the door had sealed shut. His pulse thudded in his ears. He scrambled to the stairs, crowbar clanging against each step. He shoved at the door, immovable, locked from the outside. "Linda!" His voice boomed, muffled by the concrete. "Linda!" Silence. He pressed his ear to the door. Nothing but the faint hum of the woods. No footsteps, no reply. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to breathe slow. Panic would waste oxygen, though the stench already clawed at his lungs. He descended again, flashlight beam skimming over the stacked boxes, the scraps of paper curling with age, and the bones. Always the bones. He crouched beside the nearest pile. The flashlight revealed the jagged grin of a skull, jaw broken clean away. A faint scrap of fabric clung to its collarbones, plaid, sun-faded. He lifted it carefully. A child's shirt. Thomas swallowed hard. He steadied the beam on the wall above the remains. Scratches marred the concrete. Frantic lines etched by fingernails, tally marks cut into stone. A message carved deeper than the rest. "Still here." His stomach churned. He forced himself to step back, pressing against the damp wall. He could almost hear them, voices layered in the silence, whispers of the vanished, threads of pain winding together. Stephen, Marla, Claire, all of them. The ledger hadn't been just a record. It was a ledger of sacrifice. Above ground, Linda paced the edge of the clearing. Her fingers dug crescents into her palms. She had watched Thomas slip into the bunker, his flashlight a small star in the dark, and then the slam of the door had jolted her like a whip. She ran forward, pounding on the concrete. "Thomas! Thomas, answer me!" Only her own ragged breath came back. She staggered back toward the road, fumbling with her phone. But there were no bars, not out here. Just dead air. Her mind screamed for her to run, to drive to town, to fetch help. But the thought of leaving him trapped gnawed at her. She hovered, torn, until a noise froze her where she stood. Gravel crunching, tires rolling. She ducked behind the brush, peering through leaves. Headlights cut a pale arc across the clearing. The blue pickup rolled in slow, steady. Carnes, Linda's heart pounded so hard she feared he'd hear it. She sank low, the weeds clawing at her skin, forcing herself still as the truck parked beside the bunker. The driver's door opened. Boots struck gravel. Below, Thomas heard it too. The heavy thud of footsteps overhead. Dust sifted from the ceiling. His pulse jolted. He pressed himself into the corner, flashlight extinguished, swallowing the dark like poison. The lock screeched. Metal rasped. The door cracked open, spilling in a wedge of light. Boots descended the steps, each echo deliberate. A figure emerged, broad-shouldered, scar on the chin catching the beam of a lighter. The sulfur flare lit his face, eyes glittering with cruel amusement. Carnes. "Well, well." His voice was a rasp, amused but cold. "I wondered who'd stir up old ghosts. Should have known it'd be a cop." Thomas gripped the crowbar, his palms slick. "You killed them," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. Carnes laughed, the sound bouncing off the walls. "Killed? Number. I kept them. Fed the ledger what it asked for. You think this place belongs to me? It's older than me. Older than Mason, older than any of us." He swept the lighter's glow across the bones, eyes gleaming. "We just honored the tradition." Thomas's skin crawled. "You're insane." "Insane." Carnes stepped closer, boots crunching bone fragments. "Look around. These aren't victims, they're offerings. The ledger keeps balance. You burn it, you break it, and you'll find out what it really takes." Thomas raised the crowbar. Carnes only smirked. "You don't get it yet," Carnes said softly. "The book doesn't want me. It wants you above ground." Linda's legs trembled as she crept closer to the door. She could hear voices faintly rising from the depths. Thomas's steady tone, Carnes's low growl. She spotted something leaning against the truck bed, a shotgun, barrel glinting in the dusk. Her breath caught. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But another voice whispered louder, "If you leave, he dies, like your parents." Linda's fingers closed around the shotgun stock. The wood was rough, the weight startling. She clutched it to her chest, forcing herself toward the concrete mouth of the bunker. Below, Carnes circled, lighter flame flickering. "You know what I admire about you, Hale," he said. "You're stubborn. But stubborn men break the hardest. Same way your kind always broke when you came sniffing around in the old days." Thomas steadied the crowbar, forcing calm into his voice. "Where's the rest of them?" "The ones not down here?" Carnes tilted his head, eyes glinting. "Some are ash. Some are water. Some are nothing you'd recognize anymore. But their names... their names live in the book. That's the beauty." Flesh rots, but ink remembers. Thomas tightened his grip. "Then let's see if ink bleeds." He lunged. The crowbar swung, metal whistling. Carnes dodged, the lighter flying from his hand. Darkness swallowed them whole, punctuated only by the crash of bone and the roar of their struggle. The crowbar clanged against concrete. Carnes's fist slammed into Thomas's ribs, breath blasting from his lungs. They grappled, shadows colliding, the air thick with dust and rot. Then, a new sound. A click. A voice. "Step away." Light spilled from the doorway. Linda stood at the top of the stairs, shotgun braced against her shoulder, hands shaking but eyes blazing. "Carnes," she said, her voice ragged but clear. "It's over." The scarred man froze, chest heaving. His lips curled into a thin smile. "Is it?" The bunker air was thick with rot and silence, broken only by the hiss of Linda's breathing. Her finger rested stiffly on the trigger, the shotgun heavy against her shoulder. She had never held a gun in her life, but in that moment she didn't tremble like a novice. She trembled like a survivor forced back into the scene of her childhood nightmare. "Drop it," she said. Her voice wavered but didn't break. Carnes raised his hands slowly, palms out, but the smile never left his face. His eyes flicked between Linda and Thomas as if measuring which of them would falter first. "Look at you," Carnes drawled. "Little Linda Holt, all grown up. I wondered if you'd remember." Her stomach lurched. Hearing her name on his lips ripped her 30 years backward. Room 3. The damp carpet. Her parents' voices muffled by the wall. And then the manager's shadow looming at the doorway. "You took them," she whispered. Carnes tilted his head. "I didn't take anyone. The ledger chose. I just carried out its will." Thomas forced himself upright, ribs aching, crowbar still in his grip. "Enough," he barked. "You killed them. You marked them. And you're going to answer for it." Carnes's grin widened. "Answer? To who? A washed-up cop and a broken little girl? The book doesn't answer to anyone. It writes its own story." Linda's eyes burned. She shifted her stance, pressing the stock tighter against her shoulder. "Then this is where the story ends." For the first time, the smile faltered. Thomas seized the hesitation. He swung the crowbar, clipping Carnes across the shoulder. The older man staggered, crashing against the bone pile. A femur snapped under his weight with a sickening crack. Carnes roared, surging forward. Thomas braced for impact, but Linda fired. The shotgun blast thundered in the bunker, deafening. Dust rained from the ceiling. Carnes jerked sideways, blood blooming across his arm. He collapsed to one knee, cursing through gritted teeth. Linda gasped, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. The weapon clattered from her hands, but she didn't flee. She stared at the man writhing on the floor, her chest heaving with years of swallowed rage. "That's for my parents," she said. Carnes laughed, even through the pain. A ragged, gurgling sound that raised gooseflesh on Thomas's arms. "You think that matters?" Carnes rasped. "Go ahead. Kill me." But the ledger doesn't stop. You burn it. It rewrites itself. You bury it. It digs back out. You can't silence what it wants. Thomas lunged, driving the crowbar into Carnes's chest. The man choked, eyes bulging, then went still. Silence swept the bunker. Linda staggered back against the wall, trembling violently now. Thomas pulled the crowbar free, his own breath jagged. He looked at her, her eyes wide, her face pale. "It's over," he said. But as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. They climbed out of the bunker into the cool night air. The stars stretched endless above them, indifferent to the blood and bones below. The blue pickup sat waiting, silent witness. Linda sank to the ground, hugging her knees. Tears streaked down her cheeks, though she made no sound. Thomas crouched beside her. "You saved us," he said quietly. Her eyes flicked to him, haunted. "I didn't save them." He had no answer. He turned his gaze to the trees. Every instinct told him they should call the sheriff, report the scene, let the law take it from here. But Eldon's words came back. The sheriff knew. The deputies looked the other way. Would it be different now? Or would the bunker be sealed, the bones catalogued, and the truth diluted until it was another forgotten file in the archives? Thomas clenched his jaw. The ledger was the key. The ledger would tell the story in a way bones never could. He pictured the cracked leather cover lying on his kitchen table, pages heavy with names, with choices. Carnes was right about one thing. The book had survived decades of silence, and now, in his hands, it was louder than ever. They left the clearing in silence. Linda rode with her arms wrapped tight around herself, eyes fixed on the dark road. Thomas kept both hands steady on the wheel, though his mind churned. He could feel the weight of the crowbar in the trunk, sticky with Carnes' blood. He could smell the sour bunker clinging to his clothes, but most of all, he could hear the ledger whispering at the back of his mind, urging him onward. Keep turning pages, keep digging. There are more. By the time they reached town, the first light of dawn was breaking. Thomas pulled into his driveway, the bungalow dim and still. He turned to Linda. "You don't have to keep going," he said gently. "You've done enough." Her eyes met his, fierce through exhaustion. "I'm not stopping." "Not until they're found. Not until someone remembers them all." Thomas nodded. He recognized that fire. It was the same one that had kept him on cases long after others gave up. The ledger was no longer his alone. Inside, he placed the book between them. Linda opened it, her fingers brushing carefully across the inked names. Her eyes lingered on the cross-marked entries. "How many?" she whispered. "Too many," Thomas said. "And if Carnes was right, not all of them are in that bunker." They sat in silence, pages rustling as if the book turned itself. At last, Linda spoke, her voice low but steady. "Then we follow it." Line by line, Thomas studied her, this woman who had lost everything at 12, and yet still carried herself with defiance. He felt the weight of the road ahead, dangerous, consuming, but also necessary. For the first time, he let the truth settle in his chest. This wasn't just about justice. It was about memory, about refusing to let silence win. The ledger would speak, and they would listen. For 3 days, the ledger never left the kitchen table. Thomas and Linda sat across from each other, daylight to dusk, combing through the brittle pages. Coffee mugs multiplied around them, notebooks filled with dates and names, the air thick with exhaustion and obsession. The ledger seemed to breathe with them. Each time they turned a page, it was as though the house itself shifted, wood groaning faintly, air stirring in unseen drafts. Linda traced the ink with trembling fingers. "Some of these aren't even from Texas. Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico." Travelers just passing through Thomas nodded grimly. That's why it went unnoticed for so long. No single town carried the burden. Each disappearance looked isolated. But it wasn't, she whispered. No. He tapped his pen against the page. It was systemic. A machine. The ledger kept track, and Mason and Carnes kept feeding it. Linda's eyes flicked to him. Do you believe what Carnes said? That the book wants something? Thomas hesitated. He had spent his life rooted in fact, in evidence. But when he closed his eyes, he could still hear Carnes's voice echoing in the bunker. The book doesn't want me. It wants you. I believe, Thomas said slowly, that men are capable of convincing themselves of anything, even rituals, even curses. Linda's voice trembled. But the way it feels, when you touch it. Thomas didn't answer. He felt it too. On the fourth day, Thomas drove them to the Abilene courthouse again. The clerk recognized him now, handing over case files with wary eyes. They spread the records across a wooden table. Missing persons reports. Cold cases. Each stack carried the weight of vanished lives. Linda sifted through the papers with a precision born of grief. She paused on one, her breath catching. Here, she said, sliding the report toward Thomas. Alan and Rebecca Lawson, 1985, family vacation, last seen near Cisco. Thomas checked the ledger. The name was there, room 5, a faint cross mark etched in the corner. He exhaled slowly. How many does that make now? Linda counted the notepad filled with names. 33. And that's just the ones we've confirmed. The silence between them thickened. Later, over diner coffee that tasted of burnt grounds and resignation, Thomas studied Linda's face. She had grown paler, her eyes ringed with shadows, but the fire hadn't dimmed. You need rest, he said gently. She shook her head. Rest is for people who don't know what's missing. I've lived 30 years in half-light. This is the first time I've seen the truth. Her words struck him. He thought of Marion, of the nights she sat across from him, pleading for him to step away from cases that drained him. He had ignored her then too. The difference was that Linda had no one waiting at home. The motel had stolen her anchor. Thomas reached across the table, resting his hand lightly on hers. We'll finish this. Together she met his eyes, and for the first time, a small, weary smile cracked through the grief. That night, Thomas dreamed. He stood in the motel lobby, the neon sign flickering through the cracked window. The ledger lay open on the counter, pages fluttering though no wind stirred. Names bled into one another, ink dripping like fresh wounds. A voice whispered, layered, countless tongues speaking as one. Turn the page. He tried to step back, but his feet rooted to the floor. The book glowed faintly, light seeping from its spine. When he looked down, his own name was there, written in neat black ink. Thomas Greer, room 9. He woke with a start, sweat soaking his shirt. The ledger sat across the room where he had left it, closed and silent. Yet he felt certain the page had been written while he slept. The following morning, Linda suggested something Thomas hadn't dared consider. What if we talked to the families? She asked. The ones still alive. We can't be the only ones who remember. Thomas hesitated. Families meant stirring grief. Families meant reopening wounds long scarred. But families also meant testimony, proof that the sheriff's office couldn't dismiss. All right, he said. They started with the Lawson's son, now grown, living in Dallas. Then the sister of Claire Rowley in Oklahoma. Each conversation was jagged, a knife twisting open old pain. But each family remembered the motel, the night clerk, the silence that followed. And each time Thomas showed them the ledger, their hands shook as though they were touching something alive. On the drive back, Linda was quiet. The highway stretched endless, the fields burned gold under the sinking sun. Finally she spoke. Every time someone touches it, The ledger gets heavier. Do you feel it? Thomas tightened his grip on the wheel. I feel something. It's like it wants us to keep going. Like it won't stop until every name is remembered. Thomas glanced at her. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, but there was a haunted gleam in them. And what happens, he asked softly, when we reach the last name? Neither of them answered. That evening, as Thomas placed the ledger back on the table, he noticed something he hadn't before. A fresh page. It hadn't been there yesterday. The paper was crisp, the ink darker, and on it, written in the same hand that had filled the rest of the book, was a new entry. Linda Holt. Room 3. Thomas's breath caught. His hands trembled as he turned the page back and forth. The sheet was real, not imagined. Linda, he called. His voice cracked. She appeared from the hall, her eyes immediately drawn to the book. She froze. Her name stared back at her, her face drained of color. It knows me, she whispered. Thomas's chest tightened. Carnes had been right. The book was not finished, and now it had chosen its next victim. Linda stood frozen, her name staring back at her in black ink. The letters curved neat and deliberate, as if written by a careful clerk long dead. Linda Holt. Room 3. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her hands lifted, hovering over the page, then dropped to her sides as though touching it might complete some unspoken ritual. Thomas forced himself to breathe. We didn't write that, he said, though the obviousness of it made the words feel brittle. Linda's eyes flicked to him, wide with terror. Then who did? They both knew the answer. The ledger wrote itself. Thomas closed the book abruptly, the thud echoing through the quiet bungalow. We don't look at it again tonight, he said firmly. Not until we've cleared our heads. Linda nodded, but her expression betrayed her. She was still staring at the book, shoulders tense, body angled as if she were ready to snatch it open again. Sleep offered no peace. Thomas lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. Every creak of the house felt like a whisper. He rose at 2 a.m, padded barefoot to the kitchen. The ledger sat on the table where he had left it, innocent and silent in the dim glow of the street lamp outside. Yet he felt its presence like a second heartbeat. He gripped the edge of the table, fighting the pull. A small voice inside urged him, "One more page, just look." He forced himself back to bed, but the urge stayed with him until dawn. By morning, Linda was gone. Her coffee cup sat half-finished on the counter, her scarf draped across the chair. Thomas checked the driveway. Empty. A folded note rested beside the ledger. I need to see room 3. Don't follow. Thomas swore under his breath. He grabbed his keys, ignoring the protest in his ribs, and sped down the highway. The Red Haven Motel loomed like a scar on the landscape. Its roof sagged deeper with every season. Weeds clawed up the siding, but the neon vacancy sign still hung stubbornly, half-lit in the daylight. Linda's car sat parked in the gravel lot. Thomas entered through the lobby, the air stale and sharp with mildew. "Linda!" he called, voice low but urgent. No answer. He moved down the hall, flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Room 3's door stood open. Inside, Linda crouched by the bed frame, hands trembling as she pulled something from beneath the rusted springs. A child's drawing, sun-faded, edges curling, 2 stick figures holding hands with a smaller one between them. The words in crayon, "Me, Mom, Dad." Her breath came ragged. "I left this here," she whispered. "The night they vanished." I remember Thomas's chest tightened. Proof. Small but undeniable. But before he could speak, a noise scraped the silence. The scuff of a boot in the hall. Thomas raised his flashlight, crowbar at the ready. "Who's there?" A shadow shifted beyond the doorway. Then a voice, smooth and unfamiliar. "You shouldn't be here." A man stepped into the frame. Tall, lean. wearing a deputy's badge on his belt. His hand rested on the grip of his holstered gun. Thomas's gut clenched. "You're not with the sheriff's office," he said flatly. The man smiled faintly. "Not anymore. But some of us keep traditions alive." His eyes flicked to Linda. The ledger's already written her name. Linda backed against the wall, clutching the drawing to her chest. "You can't have me." The deputy shook his head slowly. "It's not about want. It's about balance." Thomas stepped forward, crowbar raised. "Stay away from her." The man's smile widened. "You think you can fight it? You've already lost. Your name's in there too, old man." The words hit Thomas like a stone. He had dreamed it, but hearing it aloud carved it into reality. The standoff stretched thin as wire. Thomas's pulse thundered. He could take the deputy if he moved first, but the gun would fire before the crowbar landed. Linda's breath was shallow, her fingers clutching the crayon drawing until it nearly tore. She whispered, more to herself than to either man, "I won't let them take me again." And before Thomas could stop her, she lunged, not at the deputy, but at the ledger. She had brought it with her, tucked in her bag. She slammed it open on the bed, pages flaring. The names glowed faintly, ink shimmering like wet tar. The deputy recoiled, his face tightening. Thomas shielded his eyes against the unnatural light. The air vibrated, low and hungry, as though the book had awakened in their presence. Linda screamed, her voice sharp and defiant. "You don't own me." And the page with her name, Linda Holt, room 3, tore itself free, fluttering upward before disintegrating into ash. The glow died. The ledger fell silent, limp and ordinary once more. The deputy cursed, retreating into the hall. "You don't know what you've done," he hissed. Then he was gone, boots pounding down the corridor, leaving only dust in his wake. Silence. Thomas lowered the crowbar slowly, chest heaving. Linda collapsed onto the bed, clutching the drawing. Her eyes were wide but burning with something fierce. "I changed it," she whispered. "It wanted me. But I changed it." Thomas stared at the ledger, heart hammering. For the first time, he believed what Carnes had said. The book wasn't just record. It was alive. And now it had lost something it had claimed. The question lingered, heavy as the air around them. What would it take in return? The motel seemed to exhale when they left. Thomas locked the front door behind them, the heavy chain rattling, but it felt symbolic at best. The ledger rode in Linda's arms, wrapped in an old towel like something that could burn skin if touched directly. They drove in silence, the road unspooling beneath them, dusk bleeding across the horizon. Thomas kept checking the rear-view mirror, half expecting headlights to appear, the deputy's pale grin catching them like a wolf tracking prey. But the highway remained empty. The only sound, the low hum of the engine and the faint whisper of pages shifting inside the bundle Linda clutched. She stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, the child's drawing folded carefully in her coat pocket. "You did something back there," Thomas said finally. His voice was gravel, more awe than accusation. "I tore my name out." Linda's tone was flat, almost dazed. "It didn't want me anymore." Thomas glanced at her. "And what if it wants me now?" Linda didn't answer. They reached town after nightfall. The sheriff's office was dark, only one patrol car parked outside. Thomas drove past, unwilling to test whether the badge-wearing deputy had allies inside. He parked behind the library instead, where shadows pooled deep. Inside their rented bungalow, Linda set the ledger on the table like an artifact too volatile to hold. Thomas grabbed 2 beers from the fridge and set one beside her. Neither touched theirs. The ledger remained still, but the room didn't. The air felt heavier, as if pressing against their lungs. The light bulb overhead flickered twice before holding steady. Linda whispered, "It's angry." Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Angry at you? Or at both of us? The ledger shifted. Not much. Just enough for the towel to slump sideways, revealing its cracked spine. Thomas froze. He hadn't touched it. Neither had Linda. Don't, she said sharply, catching his wrist before he could reach to cover it again. It wants you to. At midnight, the banging started. 3 hard knocks on the door, followed by silence. Thomas grabbed the crowbar. Linda pressed her back against the wall, and together, they waited. The knocks came again, slower this time, deliberate. Sheriff's office, a man's voice called. We need to ask a few questions. Thomas's blood ran cold. He recognized it, the same deputy from the motel. He tightened his grip on the crowbar. You're not the sheriff, he growled through the door. A pause, then soft laughter. Doesn't matter what I am. Open up, Mr. Holt. Ledger already has your name. Linda's hand shot out, gripping Thomas's arm. Don't. Silence stretched. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then stilled. Heavy footsteps receded into the night. When Thomas finally looked back at the table, the towel had slipped fully away. The ledger lay bare, pages fluttering, though no window was open. The top page was blank. And then, right before their eyes, letters began to form. Thomas Holt, Room 5. He staggered back as though struck. No. His voice cracked and he slammed the ledger shut, as if that might erase the words. No, I'm not. Linda gripped his shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. Her eyes blazed, wet but steady. You're still here. That means it isn't finished with you. We can fight it. Thomas shook his head. You tore your page, but if I try, then we'll tear it together. The next morning, they didn't risk staying in the bungalow. Thomas packed their few belongings into the trunk while Linda carried the ledger, still unwrapped, against her chest. Where are we going? She asked. To the motel. Thomas replied grimly. If this thing wants me in room 5, then that's where we're going. I'm not hiding from it anymore. The drive out felt heavier than the night before, as if every mile pulled them deeper into something that had been waiting decades to be complete. The motel rose in the distance, stark against the pale morning light. A pair of crows perched on the sagging sign, their wings black against the sky. Room 5's door hung crooked, half off its hinges. Thomas stepped inside, crowbar in hand, ledger tucked under his arm. The room smelled of damp rot, but beneath it was something sharper, iron, old blood. He set the ledger on the bed. It opened on its own, pages fluttering until it stopped exactly where his name was written. Thomas Holt, Room 5. Linda's hand found his. Now, she whispered. Together they gripped the page. The paper resisted, stretching like skin. A sound rose from deep within the motel, not human but vast, like the building itself was groaning in pain. Thomas pulled harder. The page tore halfway, then stopped. Ink bled across the tear, stitching itself closed as fast as they could rip it. Linda gasped. It's fighting back! Thomas roared, muscles straining, every fiber in his body screaming. The ledger shuddered, a violent tremor rattling the entire bed frame. A crack spidered across the ceiling plaster, and then, with a sound like a scream, the page ripped free. Silence crashed down. The torn sheet disintegrated into ash in Thomas's hand. The ledger snapped shut, as if sulking. Thomas collapsed onto the bed, chest heaving, ash drifting down onto his shirt. Linda pressed her forehead to his. You're still here. It didn't take you. He clutched her hand, but fear gnawed at him even through relief. Because in the quiet, as the motel walls settled, he could swear he heard pages turning. Somewhere in the depths of the book, new ink was already forming. The motel did not release them. Even after the page turned to ash, Thomas felt tethered, as though invisible strings bound him to the sagging walls. He wanted to leave, but his legs trembled when he tried to step outside. Linda crouched by him, her hand on his shoulder. "We can't stay here," she said, though her own voice shook. "It's done with you. We don't owe it anything anymore." Thomas glanced toward the ledger lying shut on the bed. The cracked leather cover looked ordinary again, but he knew better now. The book wasn't just a record. It was a contract, and contracts always had fine print. "Listen," Linda whispered. Footsteps. Outside, gravel shifted beneath boots. A car door slammed, then another. Thomas staggered to the window, careful to stay hidden. Through the grime-smeared glass, he saw them. 3 men in plain clothes, all carrying weapons. One of them wore the same deputy's badge he'd seen the night before. The man with a pale grin. "They're here for it," Thomas muttered. The men fanned out. One heading toward the office, one circling behind the building. The deputy came straight for room 5. Thomas gripped the crowbar and motioned for Linda to get back. The door creaked open before the deputy even touched it, as though the motel itself wanted to welcome him in. He stepped across the threshold, gun drawn, smile wide. "You've done something foolish," he said. His gaze flicked to the bed where the ledger lay. It doesn't like when people break the rules. Thomas raised the crowbar. "Stay away from her." The deputy chuckled softly. "You think this is about you too? This place has been feeding for decades. You're just the latest names." Linda's hand darted into her coat pocket. She pulled out the crayon drawing she'd found beneath the bed in room 3. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the deputy's smugness. "You took them. The couple who stayed here. My parents." The deputy's smile faltered for the first time. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do." Her grip on the drawing tightened until her knuckles whitened. "This book took them, and you helped it. You've been helping it all along." The deputy's eyes darkened. "It's not about helping. It's about balance. People disappear so others can stay. You should have left when your name showed up." He raised the gun. Thomas moved first, swinging the crowbar with every ounce of strength left in him. The blow knocked the gun aside, the shot exploding into the wall. Plaster rained down, choking the air with dust. Linda screamed. The ledger shuddered on the bed, pages riffling like wings in a storm. The other 2 men burst into the room. One lunged for Thomas, the other grabbed Linda by the arm. The ledger's cover flew open, glowing now, ink spilling across the pages in twisting, shifting shapes. Names old and new. Some Thomas recognized. People from town who had vanished, couples whispered about in local bars. Others were strangers, but all of them screamed from the page, their voices filling the room without mouths to make them. Linda wrenched free of the man holding her and reached for the book. "If it wants balance, then it can take me." "No!" Thomas bellowed, shoving his attacker back into the wall. The deputy grabbed Linda by the wrist. "You don't get to choose." "It chooses," but Linda's other hand slammed onto the ledger's open page. The glow intensified, a searing white that filled the room. The men staggered back, shielding their eyes. Thomas dropped to his knees, blinded, but he felt it. The motel shaking, the ground vibrating as though the earth itself was trying to swallow the building whole. Linda's voice cut through the roar. "You don't own us anymore." A sound like tearing fabric split the air. When Thomas's vision cleared, the room was in ruins. The plaster had collapsed, floorboards splintered, the ceiling sagging. The 3 men were gone. No bodies, no blood. Only their weapons left on the floor. The deputy's badge lay cracked in 2. Linda stood in the middle of it all, the ledger clutched to her chest. Her eyes were wet, but steady. "It let them go," she whispered. "All of them." Thomas rose unsteadily, disbelief clawing at his chest. "What do you mean?" She opened the book to show him. The pages were blank. Every name, every entry, gone. But at the very back, scrawled in fresh ink, were just 2 words. Balance owed. Thomas's stomach turned. What did you give it? Linda shook her head slowly, as if trying to convince herself as much as him. Not us. Something else. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. The motel had finally drawn too much attention. They left the ruins of room 5 behind, the ledger silent in Linda's arms. But as Thomas helped her into the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that the debt hadn't been erased, just delayed. The sirens grew louder, winding through the back roads toward Redhaven. Thomas drove fast, gravel spitting from the tires. Linda clutched the ledger on her lap, silent, eyes fixed on the windshield as though afraid to blink. The words scrawled at the back, balance owed, burned in both their minds. Red and blue lights flared in the rear view. Thomas's chest tightened. They're coming for us. Linda shook her head faintly. No, they're coming for it. By the time they reached the town limits, 2 patrol cars had boxed them in. Thomas slowed, heart pounding, crowbar wedged against the seat by his leg. The sheriff himself stepped out, a heavy man with gray hair and a shotgun resting easy in his grip. His deputies flanked him. No smiles this time, no false warmth. Just a line of men who looked like they had been waiting for this night. Mr. Holt, the sheriff called, his voice calm but carrying. Mrs. Holt. Step out of the vehicle. Bring the book. Linda's fingers dug into the ledger. If we give it back, it starts again. More names, more disappearances. Thomas's pulse hammered. If we don't. Her gaze flicked toward him, raw and determined. Then it takes us. The sheriff raised his shotgun a fraction. Last chance. Thomas opened his door slowly, raising his hands. Linda followed, clutching the ledger against her chest. The deputies moved in, weapons trained, but the sheriff gestured for them to hold. You don't know what you're holding, the sheriff said. His eyes were locked on Linda. That book keeps this town alive. Outsiders come, they vanish, and we stay. That's the balance. Linda's voice trembled, but she didn't look away. It wrote my name. It wrote his. That balance is finished. The sheriff's jaw hardened. Then it will choose new names. That's how it works. Thomas stepped forward, crowbar in hand. Not anymore. The air shifted before anyone could move. Wind tore across the street, scattering leaves and gravel. The sky above the town rippled as though a storm had cracked open, but no clouds moved. Only silence, thick and suffocating. The ledger snapped open in Linda's arms. Pages flipped violently, faster than the eye could follow, until they stopped at the very back. Fresh words bled across the paper, large and final. Balance collected. Linda gasped. Thomas turned toward her just as her knees buckled. No! He caught her, cradling her against him, but her skin was already cold. The light drained from her eyes as though something had been pulled out from behind them. Her chest rose once, then stilled. The ledger closed itself. Thomas roared, the sound raw enough to split his throat. He grabbed the book and hurled it into the middle of the road. It landed with a dull thud, silent, ordinary again. The sheriff and his deputies stood frozen, their faces pale, weapons forgotten at their sides. No one else, Thomas spat, his voice ragged. No one else goes into that book. He raised the crowbar and brought it down on the ledger. Once, twice, over and over until the spine cracked, pages tearing loose, scattering like dead leaves. The wind howled, carrying the fragments upward. They didn't burn, didn't glow. They just dissolved, vanishing into the night. When it was done, nothing remained but Thomas on his knees, Linda's still body in his arms. Hours later, the motel burned. Someone, no one said who, had doused the walls with gasoline and struck a match. By dawn, only blackened beams stood against the sky, smoke curling into the wind. The sheriff filed no report. No one in town asked questions. The official word was simple. An accident, long overdue. But Thomas knew better. The balance had been paid. He buried Linda beneath the oak tree behind their bungalow, far from the motel's reach. No sermon, no marker. Just the earth closing over her as the wind whispered through the leaves. As he pressed the soil flat, his hand brushed something hard. He dug carefully until his fingers closed on a scrap of paper, yellowed and fragile. A single page from the ledger. On it, written in faint ink, were 2 words: Thomas Holt. No room number, no date, just his name, waiting. The motel's ashes cooled quickly. By the end of the week, bulldozers arrived to level the ruins. Within a month, the lot was bare, only a rectangle of scorched earth marking where the Red Haven Motel had stood for half a century. The official story was neat. Abandoned property, electrical fire, collapse. No mention of the names that had filled a book now reduced to smoke. No mention of the people who had vanished behind its walls. Thomas gave no interviews. When local reporters tried, he shut his door. The sheriff's office issued statements about rebuilding and healing. But the town moved on with a practiced ease. They had always known something about the motel. Now, with its husk gone, they could pretend it had never existed. But Thomas couldn't. He stayed in the bungalow for a while, drifting through rooms where Linda's scarf still hung on a chair, where her handwriting filled grocery lists pinned to the fridge. He spoke aloud sometimes, as though she might answer. She never did. The crowbar leaned by the door, its steel dented from strikes against the ledger. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It felt like the only honest record of what had happened. One evening, near dusk, he drove back to the empty lot where the motel had stood. The ground was barren now, bulldozed flat, but he could still smell the ghost of smoke in the soil. He stood in the middle of it, closing his eyes. For a moment, he thought he heard voices, laughter, faint and distant, the hum of neon, the click of a typewriter in the office. Shadows passed behind his eyelids, a parade of faces half remembered from photographs. He opened his eyes. The lot was empty. But something white fluttered against the chain-link fence at the far edge. Thomas walked to it slowly, heart pounding, until he saw what it was. A scrap of paper caught on the wire, weather-stained, edges curling. On it, faint but legible, was a line of ink. Room 6, check-in pending. There was no name yet, just the room. Thomas crumpled the page in his fist and shoved it deep into his pocket. He didn't know if the book had truly burned, or if it had only scattered, waiting to be rewritten. But he knew one thing. The motel was gone, yet its ledger still had pages left to fill, and somewhere, someone would be next.